In this 20-minute talk about my work, I'm going to show you how some of the ways I use the techniques and materials I started with have changed and evolved over the years I've been making. I think evolution is a good word to think about when looking at craft, as while acknowledging origins and traditions, it suggests that there can and will be change. It can feel unresolved and disrespectful to ignore tradition, but restricting to be held back by it. And this tension between the practice it takes to learn and perfect a skill and the flashes of inspiration that pop in and break the rules is where so many interesting things can happen in making. I'm Bridget Bailey. I've been a self-employed maker for 40 years. If I had to describe myself in one word, it would be maker. If I'm allowed a second word, it might be artist. I'm not sure if I think of myself as an artist, but I'd like to. A third word might have to be gardener. I'm already worried about whether these are the right words in the right order. And when I have to describe myself, I immediately get into the difficulty of not wanting to be limited to one thing or to have aspects of special interest and importance to me and my work overlooked. I want to say textiles and botany and millinery and collecting and so on. But in this talk, I have the luxury of 20 minutes and lots of images to tell you about myself. This is a flora and fauna installation. It's a mass of tiny sculptures inspired by the relationships between plants and insects. I have an allotment and a hen, and these two things have a big influence on my work and my view of gardening. Hens love to eat weeds. They like sow thistle and dandelions, and they know by the taste that ryegrass has the most protein, even though other grasses look more juicy and tender. I never studied biology at school, but I grew up on a farm, and it reminds me of my dad talking about mowing the hay at the right time to catch the nutrients in the grass. This combination of allotment and hen has got me thinking more about how nature works as well as how it looks. This is Lawnscape, a framed artwork inspired by not cutting the lawn. And it's about what grows on the lawn if it's left alone, which mine often is. It might take years, but if it's left alone long enough, it might turn into a meadow. This piece is inspired by the range of species that might be found in a strip of meadow. I might use a whole range of materials and techniques to describe the different species. A sort of biodiversity of techniques instead of mono-making. I love intricate details and the sort of visual pun that pops up when something reminds me of something else. I've cut this little parakeet feather I found in the park so it looks like an unripe head of barley. These types of artwork take over 50 hours of making, and that doesn't include planning the layout, which takes lots of practicing and arranging to get it looking right. It wants to look random but still have the right spacing. Each stem needs 2 stitches through the card to hold it in place. And there's 86 stems in this piece. I'm just as impatient as anyone else by nature, but over all the years I've been making, I've had to practice and develop a strong patience muscle to manage the repetitive, intricate nature of the type of making I do. It's possibly the hardest one to learn, but it's one of the skills I value the most. I grew up near Whitby on the edge of the North York Moors National Park. It's a unique environment with its own special flora and fauna. I spent lots of time as a child hunting for special moths and caterpillars on the moors. and also lots of time beachcombing and hunting for shells and fossils. My mum was an artist and my sister's a potter, so art was always there in the family as a thing to do. It was on the foundation course in Scarborough that I first discovered textiles. I didn't know it was a thing before then. I went to Farnham and did a 3-year degree course in textiles. Very hands-on. I loved experimenting and seeing what fabrics could do. And I ended up specialising in a collection of fabrics combining pleat and print. I moved to London in 1984 and set up a studio doing pleating. It was my first career stage. I made collections of scarves for Liberty, but to be honest, I was always a bit scared of fashion. My plan was to find a designer to use my fabrics for garments. I took my fabric collection to show Jean Muir, and she said, make me some hats. So that is how I got into hat making. In at the deep end, using my pleating techniques to make sculptural headpieces and learning as I went along. And I made hats for her collections as a freelancer for the next 5 years. 1989 saw the start of the Bailey-Tomlin partnership with my lovely business partner Anne. This was a more commercial phase of hat making. To give a portrait of the business, showing at London Fashion Week seemed to take care of marketing at that time. The collection sold to Liberty, Harvey Nichols, Saks Fifth Avenue, Henry Bendel, Mitsukoshi in Japan. We sold to department stores all over the world. The hats were blocked in a factory in Luton and machine finished. Although we did quite a bit of the making, we also had 2 full-time staff and several outworkers. We made big collections for summer and winter, each one having about 50 styles. All the stores would want exclusivity, so there was lots of bending over backwards to tweak designs and make them look different. We produce around 2,000 hats a year. Big deadlines, big orders, lots and lots of pieces the same. We made our own trims in-house, and that was how we managed to be adaptable and original. There's a hand-rolling technique for edges in hat making, and one year I had to roll the edges of 1,000 lilies in the evenings, as well as all the other work that was going on. I had to do a certain number each day or I got behind and the total went up. I couldn't have made myself do it if I'd not had to, but I'm glad I did. There's a sort of making fitness that can only be earned through intense repetitive doing, and it's made my rolling of edges what it is today. Things started to change in the business around 2004. Many of the millinery manufacturers moved their production abroad, department stores franchised, many gave up their hat departments altogether, and price points dropped. Faced with all this, that's when I noticed I'm much more of a maker than a manufacturer by nature. I had to start to reinvent myself and find a way of making that felt relevant. And I began to make my work much more refined and special. That's an easy sentence to say, but it's a big thing to change. I think I'll always be on that journey. The factory-blocked hat bases vanished, and the skills I'd used to make the trims became the new hats. It was a very scary time about money. Looking for new markets, new things to make, new ways of selling, and places to sell that could match the time I was spending on the work I was making. This iris headpiece was commissioned by a special gardener at Chelsea Flower Show for the press day. I took my hats to show a wedding dress designer who said, make me some fabrics. That was a kind of reverse on what happened with Jean Muir, and I made garment details for her wedding dresses, silk strawberries and pleating and shredded chiffon that floated like ostrich feathers. I took a collection of hats to the World Cup millinery exhibition, a big horse racing event in Dubai. Finding ways to sell retail felt like the way forward. I used my millinery skills to make some handbags. This was a feature in Italian Vogue about alternative materials to leather. This is a bag I made for an exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So lots of one-off exhibitions and commissions. I think of them as one-night stands compared to the long-term relationships I used to have with department stores. Here's a glimpse of one of my scariest commissions. A company called Ettinger, who made beautiful leather goods, asked me to make a piece for their press day at Liberty, and the brief was to show what a wonderful, versatile material leather is, having never worked with it before. This is a wreath I made for a stand at Decorex using the same techniques. I'm still making hats at this time, but as an idea they have to have a good reason to be made as a hat. The Mad for Tea exhibition at Fortnum & Mason was definitely a good reason to make hats. I did my take on a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. It made more elegant hat lines to have stuff spilling down your face and staying neatly in the cup or the spoon. This was in 2013, and by then I'd been making for 20 years. It was around then that I started teaching masterclasses. Any sooner and I'd have felt like a fraud, as I'm mostly self-taught. Teaching is a great contrast to the intense, solitary, one-off making that I do now. It's actually improved my making by helping me understand what the hell it is that I'm doing that makes it come out the way it does. And I enjoy the challenge of explaining things that are a bit beyond words, whether it's with diagrams or pinches or sometimes grunts. It's been a long time coming, but my aim has been to change my brand to be more of an artist who might make a hat if it fits the idea, instead of being a hat maker who might make the odd bit of art. And now I'm far more likely to have put 1,000 ideas into one piece of work, instead of repeating the same idea 1,000 times. Now I'm going to revisit some of the techniques in the work I do now, having shown you my past and my influences. I didn't make this. It's a wonderful bud I saw in the Botanical Gardens in Melbourne, but it sums up some of the principles of pleating rather beautifully. There are structural rules about making a pleat mould in paper that look very stiff and geometric and don't seem like they could be at all organic. But once fabric's pleated, it can take on flow and swirl, and there's the option of pleating on the straight grain or the bias that give a whole range of possibilities. The actual plant itself suggested a plan for finishing the edges neatly and keeping the folds together. I've used my straw rolling technique and tucked the piece of pleating into it, like a sort of pleats in the pod. In traditional hat making, hats are formed on moulds that are called blocks. And the process of shaping the straw, or whatever material the hat's made in, is called blocking. The hat material is pinned onto the block to stretch it tight and smooth, and then stiffened with a type of varnish or PVA and allowed to dry to set the shape before being lifted off and made into a hat. This hat and the pinned straw in the previous photo were made by Dylan Woolwork, and I've used his work to show you because it's a contemporary example of traditional blocking techniques and classic, beautifully made millinery. Milliners have always found and made other things to block on too, and here I've dyed some very wispy abaca fibre and blocked it over some smaller shapes. It's so fragile, it took loads of thin layers of varnish to keep the shape, It was very tricky to get it off the block without distorting. But I love the delicate X-ray effect. It's kind of more like a 3D drawing of a still life than a big solid thing. Makes it very light and airy. This bean pod's empty, but blocked to show that there were bean shapes in it once. And the way the edges of the pods are rolled is a typical millinery finish where a wire is rolled into the edge, just in the way there would be a wire in the edge of a hat brim. The bottoms of the flowers are made from abaca fibre, and the shaping that gives the vase-like curve to their waists is a micro sort of blocking. These tiny shapings or blockings that I do with my work is such an important part of giving things shape and character and getting the kind of personalities I want into my pieces, like a sort of 3D drawing. Being able to dye colours from scratch or tint and change them a bit is such a great thing. Because I started my dyeing career in textiles, I think it came into my millinery a bit bigger and bolder and wetter, and it stayed a bit like that. I'd always dye it rather than buy it if I can. Even though it's harder work, there's something special about choosing the colour instead of accepting what's there already. Millinery often demands colour matching, and that can often mean dyeing straw to match satin and trying to choose between matching the highlights or the lowlights of the fabric of the dress. But now I'm choosing whether the grass is green or ripened and gold and wondering how much red might suggest the kind of sunburntness of a dandelion seed head in a meadow. Textiles are very beautiful anyway, so that's a big help when making things out of them. These strawberries are made from dyed silk chiffon, and chiffon gives a beautiful two-tone effect when one colour glows through another. It also suggests the idea of the skin of the fruit being a different colour from the flesh as it glows through. The colour and texture of fabrics suggest ideas. And here are a selection of bees' bottoms. Some are veiling over velvet with the fuzzy texture popping through. Some are velvet just prickling through chiffon. The yellow veiling is meant to suggest covered in pollen. Some of the bees have 4 layers of fabric and veiling to get the shade that suggests bee to me. They're going to go on a massive lavender for an exhibition I'm working on. I've also been making smaller insects, and this is an attempt at a midge. And it could also be a suggestion of a bee in the distance. I'd really like to find ways of suggesting insects zooming by in a bit of a blur, but I've not found a way of making out of focus that I'm happy with so far. I started researching some fly tying techniques to see what comes out of them. I have a wonderful old book from the 1800s full of these sort of diagrams. It's full of traditional ways of doing things and very detailed and of its time, and it takes lots of reading and practice to get anywhere with it. What I've taken from it so far is a much more intense approach to binding. Finding more ways to finish the ends and using thinner, finer threads to bind with. It's a steep learning curve, and I need to keep practicing, as these tiny fiddly things need a sort of micro fitness that can very easily drain away if you don't keep doing it. This tangle is a mass of insects' legs. Each one is bound together with a wire that's so fine it's like working with a strand of hair. I practiced making some larger insects along the way, and this is a more abstracted piece that evolved from that. It's inspired by the idea of the creeping, crawling movement of an insect's leg in a sort of time-lapse photography way. I remember thinking as I made them, surely 10 legs will be enough, but in the end I had to make 20. They are very fiddly. So, to sum up, we've been back in time and behind the scenes with my work and looked at traditional ways of making, long-term relationships with techniques and materials, and a bit of intense observing of nature. And when it's all going well, which it isn't always, these elements are like a little corporate team working together. The combinations they make by relating to each other can suggest unexpected ideas, like using some of the lightness and swirl of millinery and the micro detail of fly tying to make a ring inspired by the buzzing of insects. I've found that this noticing of the evolution in my own work has changed the way I think about the work of other makers. It's led to a richer level of noticing and appreciating how all makers, both past and present, play their part in a constant evolution of the techniques and materials they use in their work.